Tonight we are heading into Harlem, where the streetlights hum and the coffee never tastes quite legal. This is the calm crime story of Frank Lucas, a man who learned to stay quiet, stay useful, and move like a shadow with a ledger. No shouting, no glamour, just soft tension, dry humor, and the slow sound of consequences catching up. Settle in, breathe easy, and let the city whisper. Chapter 1. The Quiet Boy from Grange. Harlem liked to pretend it never slept. Even when the night went thin and the sky turned the color of weak tea, the blocks still breathed. A delivery truck coughed near a curb. A man laughed too loud at a joke nobody else wanted. Somewhere, a radio played a slow song that sounded tired of being brave. Frank Lucas sat near a window that would not fully close. The frame had been painted so many times it moved like it had arthritis. He did not mind. A small draft was honest, and honesty was rare in his line of work. He held a cup of coffee and did not rush it. Coffee was one of the last legal thrills, and he treated it with respect. Outside, the first buses started their route. The city warmed up its voice, clearing its throat like it was about to sing a long day. Frank watched the street the way a man watches water, not because it was pretty, but because it could drown you. He had learned that lesson early, long before Harlem, long before the neat suits, long before people started saying his name like it was a headline. He was from Grange, North Carolina, a small town where the air could feel sweet and the rules could feel bitter. In Grange you learned who owned the land, who owned the law, and who owned you, even if nobody said it out loud. As a boy, Frank learned to move quietly. He learned to listen more than he spoke. He learned that loud people drew attention, and attention was a bill that always came due. One memory kept returning like a song you wished you could forget. A day when the world showed him its teeth. He was young, and he watched a relative get unalived in a moment that changed the shape of his heart. The men responsible wore fear like a uniform. That kind of fear did not ask for permission. It just showed up and expected you to accept it. Frank did not accept it. Not in the way they meant. He carried that day like a stone in his pocket. Not for sympathy, not for drama, just as proof. Proof that the world could take what it wanted, and proof that he would have to learn how to take something back, even if it was only control over his own life. In Grange, control was a limited resource. It was like clean water in a dry season. You could find it, but you did not brag about it. His mother worked hard. The kind of hard that leaves you too tired to dream. People around them worked hard too, and most of them stayed poor anyway. Frank noticed that part. He noticed that hard work was not always rewarded. Sometimes it was only collected, like rent. He also noticed something else. Some men did not work hard at all, at least not in the fields or the factories. Some men wore clean shirts and had time to lean against a wall. They always seemed to know someone. They always seemed to be on the right side of a closed door. Frank did not love them. He studied them. He tried honest jobs because that is what a young man does when he still believes the posters. He hauled, he lifted, he ran errands. He took whatever he could get. But the pay was thin and the disrespect was thick. Every day felt like someone was gently pushing his head underwater and telling him to be grateful. He stole small things at first, not because he wanted shiny objects, because he wanted options. A little cash meant a little freedom. A little freedom meant you could breathe without asking permission. He was not proud of it. Pride was a luxury, like a second coat. He was practical. By the time he was a teenager, he had decided North Carolina was not big enough to hold the future he wanted. He had heard of New York City like it was a myth, a place where the streets were crowded with chances, where a person could disappear into the noise and come out different. He left with more hope than luggage. That is how many people traveled then. A small bag, a stubborn heart, and a plan built out of hunger. The first time New York met him, it did not hug him. It shoved him. The air smelled like gasoline and hot metal. The buildings were tall in a way that felt personal, as if they were trying to prove something. People moved fast and looked through you like you were a ghost who owed them money. Frank found Harlem because Harlem found him. It was a neighborhood with its own heartbeat. The corners talked, the stoops listened, the storefronts watched. Everyone had a story, and everyone had an opinion about your story, even if you had not written it yet. He learned the geography of survival. Which streets were safe, which streets were only safe if you knew the right names. Which buildings had landlords who took cash without question? Which buildings had landlords who asked question anyway? He slept where he could, he worked where he could. He kept his eyes open, and his mouth mostly closed. He did not show fear, he did not show excitement. Both could be used against you. In Harlem, money moved like weather. Sometimes it rained, sometimes it dried up. Sometimes it came down so hard it flooded the block and everybody acted surprised. Frank watched the patterns. He learned that numbers mattered. Not just the lottery numbers whispered in barbershops, but the other numbers. How many men stood on a corner? How many minutes a police car sat at a light? How many times a face appeared before it disappeared? He learned about the hustles that lived in plain sight. Gambling, loans, protection, cargo that arrived at night and left before morning. People called it business. People called it crime. Frank learned it was mostly accounting with extra tension. He also learned that Harlem had kings. Not official kings, not the kind who wore crowns, but the kind who wore calm. Men who spoke softly and were listened to loudly. One name floated through the neighborhood like cigarette smoke. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. People said it with a mixture of respect and caution, like saying it too fast might invite trouble through the door. Frank heard stories before he ever saw the man. Stories about discipline, stories about rules, stories about a mind that could do math while everyone else was still counting their fingers. Frank did not chase the story. He waited for it to come near him, because chasing anything in Harlem could make you look desperate, and desperate people got used. The day he first saw Bumpy, it was not dramatic. No parade, no music, just a man stepping out of a car like he belonged to the sidewalk. He wore a suit that looked comfortable, not flashy. He walked like he had time, which was the loudest thing a man could do in that neighborhood. Frank was running an errand. Something small. A package that was not supposed to be opened. A message that was not supposed to be repeated. He did not make eye contact. Then he did, just long enough to see the weight behind Bumpy's face. Not anger, not happiness, just calculation. Frank felt for a moment like the street itself had turned to look at him. He kept walking. Later someone spoke to him. A man with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. He asked Frank a question that sounded casual. "Who are you?" With Frank answered with the truth. "Nobody." The man nodded like that was both acceptable and interesting. Then he told Frank to come by later. A particular address, a particular time. He did not threaten, he did not beg. He spoke the way a banker speaks when he offers you a loan you might not survive. Frank went, not because he thought it was safe, because he thought it was necessary. The building was ordinary, that was the point. Ordinary buildings hid extraordinary decisions. Frank walked in, sat where he was told, and waited. When Bumpy Johnson appeared, the room shifted, not by magic, by habit. People moved aside, chairs felt smaller, voices lowered. Bumpy looked at Frank like he was reading a receipt. "You are from down south," Bumpy said, and it was not a question. Frank nodded. Bumpy asked him about home, about Grange, about work, about what he wanted. Frank answered carefully. He did not flatter, he did not act tough. He just spoke like a man who did not want to waste anyone's time. Bumpy listened. Then he gave Frank a simple instruction. Start small, stay useful, do not talk too much. It was almost a kindness, almost. Frank left that meeting with no promises and no guarantees, just a door that was not fully closed anymore. In Harlem, that was a gift. That night he lay on a thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. He could hear neighbors moving. He could hear laughter from the street. He could hear distant sirens, the city's lullaby for people who had learned not to flinch. He thought about the stone in his pocket, the old memory from Grange. He thought about Bumpy's calm. He thought about the rules of this new world. Frank did not sleep right away. He did not need to. He was already dreaming, with his eyes open, planning a future that would be built from quiet decisions. The next morning he woke before the sun and washed his face in cold water. He looked at himself in a cracked mirror and practiced a neutral expression. Not sad, not proud, just steady. Then he stepped back into Harlem, where the sidewalks waited like they always did, ready to teach him the next lesson. Chapter 2. Apprenticeship on Lenox Avenue. Lenox Avenue in the daytime could look almost polite. Almost. The shops opened their gates with a metallic rattle. A bakery set out rolls that made the air smell forgiving. Old men played cards on a folding table like they were defending the honor of the neighborhood. But the street had a second face, one that showed itself to people who knew where to stand and when to leave. Frank learned that quickly. His first jobs for Bumpy's World were small, which was the point. A simple delivery, a simple pickup, a message carried from one doorway to another, the kind of work that looked like nothing from across the street. Frank liked it that way. Nothing work kept you alive long enough to become somebody. He also learned how people tested you. They did not test you with fists right away. They tested you with temptation. They would leave a little cash on a table and walk away. They would mention a plan in front of you and see if you repeated it. They would ask you to do something slightly sloppy and then watch how you fixed it. Frank passed by being boring. He returned the cash. He kept quiet. He cleaned up the sloppy job without acting like he deserved applause. In a world full of loud talkers, boring could be a superpower. Bumpy's people were not a single crew with matching jackets. They were a network of men who knew how to smile, how to threaten without words, and how to make a problem disappear into paperwork. Some were smooth, some were rough. All of them understood one thing. The boss did not like surprises. Frank watched Bumpy whenever he could, from a respectful distance. He noticed how Bumpy spoke. Not fast, not slow, just measured. He noticed how Bumpy listened to everyone, even the people who thought they were unimportant. Bumpy collected information the way some men collected stamps. Frank started collecting too. He learned the names of bar owners, doormen, building supers. He learned which cops liked free coffee and which ones liked free envelopes. He learned which church ladies could be trusted to keep a secret and which ones would spread it like butter. There was humor in it if you looked at it the right way. Harlem was full of people who pretended they hated gossip right before they delivered it with perfect accuracy. Frank started to enjoy the small hypocrisy of human nature. It made the world feel less sharp. One afternoon, Frank was sent to pick up a bag from a tailor. The tailor handed it over without a word. Frank carried it like it contained laundry, which was exactly what it looked like. On the walk back, a young man tried to get friendly. Too friendly. "What you got there?" Friend Frank smiled in a way that suggested he was either harmless or deeply inconvenient. "Just clothes," he said. The young man reached anyway. Frank stepped back. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply let the young man see his eyes. The young man reconsidered. It is amazing how quickly people discover manners when they feel seen. Frank delivered the bag and reported the encounter. The man he reported to, a mid-level captain with a shiny tie, laughed. "You are learning," the captain said. "You kept it calm. That is good. Calm keeps the police asleep." Frank nodded. He thought about that. Calm kept many things asleep. Bumpy's operation had rules, but it also had politics. Harlem was not an island. Italian crews had interests nearby. So did other groups. Everybody had a piece of something and everyone believed their piece was sacred. Frank heard names on the edges of conversations. He heard warnings about stepping on toes. He heard advice about who could be paid and who needed to be respected. It was like learning a dance where the floor moved under you. Sometimes Bumpy would invite Frank to sit in the back of a room while men talked business. Frank did not speak unless spoken to. He did not fidget. He watched. One meeting was about numbers, not the lottery kind, but the kind that lived inside ledgers. Cash going out, cash coming in, debts, promises. Frank saw how the work was mostly administration, with a mood. The men argued over small percentages like they were debating religion. Frank had to keep his face neutral. Inside, he found it almost funny. These grown men, dangerous men, could become emotional about the difference between fair and slightly less fair. Bumpy watched the argument, waited, then ended it with a short sentence. Frank did not even catch the exact words. He caught the effect. The room settled. Afterward, Frank walked with Bumpy for a block. It was not announced, it just happened. Frank matched his pace. Bumpy spoke without looking at him. "People think the work is force," Bumpy said. "The work is control." Frank listened. "If you can control yourself, you can control a room," Bumpy continued. "If you cannot control yourself, the room will control you." Frank nodded. He had seen men lose control and pay for it. He had seen men brag and then vanish. Control looked like quiet. As Frank proved himself, his errands got heavier. Not in weight, but in meaning. He began moving money more often. He began meeting men who wore their pride like a watch. He began entering apartments where the curtains stayed closed even at noon. He also began seeing how the police fit into the ecosystem. Not every officer was crooked. Not every officer was clean. Most were tired. Some were curious. Some were hungry. Frank learned which ones could be predicted. Predictable people were manageable. Unpredictable people were expensive. He had his first real scare on a night when the rain came down hard and the streetlights made puddles look like oil. He was carrying a small envelope. He had been told not to be late. A patrol car rolled slowly behind him. Frank kept walking. He did not run. Running was an invitation. The car stopped. An officer called out, "Hey, you!" Frank stopped, turned, kept his hands visible. He made his face blank, polite, slightly confused. "Yes, officer." The officer asked where he was going. Frank answered, "A reasonable place. A reasonable reason." The officer asked what was in his pocket. "Just personal things," Frank said. The officer stepped closer. He smelled like cigarettes and impatience. He studied Frank's face, searching for fear like it was contraband. Frank did not give him any. After a long moment, the officer waved him off. Frank walked away at the same pace. His heart did not pound. Not yet. He waited until he reached the next corner, then allowed himself a single breath, slow and quiet. Later, when he reported the encounter, the captain with the shiny tie shook his head. "That is why we stay calm," he said. "Your fear would have been louder than any confession." Frank stored that lesson. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into a rhythm. Frank began to feel like he understood the neighborhood's pulse. He could tell when tension was building. He could tell when a new face on the corner meant a new plan was forming. He also began to feel something else, something riskier. Confidence. It came in small doses. A successful delivery, a problem avoided, a situation smoothed over with the right words. Confidence was useful, but it was also dangerous. It could turn into arrogance if you fed it too much. Frank tried to keep it lean. Bumpy, for all his power, was still a man in a world that liked to humble men. There were whispers about health, about age, about enemies who waited for the right moment. Frank did not ask. He simply watched Bumpy's face when he thought no one was looking. The calm was still there, but Frank could see fatigue behind it, like a shadow at the edge of a lamp. One evening after a long day, Frank sat on a stoop with a paper bag of food and listened to the neighborhood talk around him. A child ran past laughing. A woman scolded him with love. A couple argued softly, more tired than angry. Frank ate slowly. He thought about Grange. He thought about the boy he had been. He thought about the man he was becoming. A friend of his, another young runner, sat beside him and nudged his shoulder. "You think you are going to be somebody, huh?" Frank looked at him and let a small smile appear. "Everybody is somebody," he said. "Some people just get paid for it." The friend laughed. The laugh was real, and it warmed the air for a moment. Then the friend lowered his voice. "You hear what people are saying." Frank did not need to ask which people. He heard. Frank kept his tone light, almost bored. "People say a lot of things," he said. "The street has too much free time." but inside he felt the soft tension of a future approaching. He understood the truth behind the gossip. When an old king grows tired, the neighborhood starts measuring crowns. Frank stood, folded the empty bag and dropped it in a bin. Small habits mattered. They kept you from feeling like an animal. He walked home under the streetlights. He did not hurry, he did not linger. He moved like a man who belonged, even if belonging was still a work in progress. At his window the same draft slipped in. Harlem breathed outside. Frank sat with another cup of coffee even though it was late. He was not trying to stay awake. He was trying to stay ready. Somewhere far down the avenue, a siren rose and faded. Frank listened until it disappeared. Then he allowed himself a quiet thought. The apprenticeship was ending. The test was about to begin. Chapter 3: When the Old Guard Disappears. The first sign that a kingdom is changing is not a parade. It is the pause. A half-second longer before someone answers a question. A glance that lingers too long on a man who used to be invisible. A room that feels slightly colder, even though the radiator is working just fine. Harlem had pauses like that in those days. Frank Lucas noticed them the way a sailor notices the wind. People were still laughing, still arguing, still playing cards on folding tables like the future depended on a good hand. But behind the noise something was shifting. Bumpy Johnson did not announce his weakness. He did not make speeches about age, he did not write a farewell letter. He just moved a little slower, and his eyes carried a little more distance, like he could already see a hallway nobody else had entered yet. Frank kept doing his work. He delivered messages, collected envelopes, smoothed disagreements before they became something louder. He stayed calm in public and counted quietly in private. He also watched how other men reacted when Bumpy walked into a room. Some men still straightened their backs, they still lowered their voices, they still acted like the rules were solid and the floor would not move. Other men, the hungry ones, looked for cracks. They asked extra questions. They offered ideas that sounded helpful but smelled like ambition. They laughed a little too quickly when Bumpy made a small mistake, like forgetting a name or asking for a detail twice. Frank did not join them. He did not need to. He did not believe in rushing the river. One afternoon, Frank went to a diner that smelled like fried onions and old coffee. A place where the napkins were thin and the opinions were thick. He sat at a small table near the back, not hiding, just choosing a seat that let him see the door. A man he knew from the neighborhood slid into the booth across from him. The man was older than Frank, with hands that looked like they had carried too many crates. His face was open, but his eyes were careful. "You hear it," the man said. Frank did not ask what. "The street always had something. People saying Bumpy is tired," the man continued. "People saying he is not long for this." Frank stirred his coffee slowly. He let the spoon tap once against the cup, a small sound that grounded him. "People have been saying that for years," Frank said. The man shrugged. "Yes, but now it sounds different." Frank leaned back. He gave the man a look that was not a threat, just a reminder. "If you want to live long enough to enjoy your opinions," Frank said, "you should keep them quiet." The man laughed softly, then nodded like he understood. In Harlem, advice often arrived disguised as sarcasm. After the man left, Frank stayed a moment longer, watching the steam rise from his cup. He remembered Bumpy's lesson about control. The work was not force, the work was control. Frank understood that control had two sides. There was control over the street, and there was control over yourself. One without the other was a gamble, and the house always won. When the change finally came, it did not arrive with fireworks. It arrived like a phone call that nobody wanted to answer. Word moved through Harlem the way weather moves through a sit-in. It came down the blocks, across barber chairs, through back rooms, into kitchens where women cooked dinners while listening to the radio and the gossip at the same time. Bumpy Johnson was gone. Some people said it like it was impossible, like the neighborhood had lost a landmark. Some people said it with a kind of relief they did not want to admit. Some people said nothing at all, which was the loudest response. Frank felt the loss like a weight, but also like an opening. He did not celebrate. He did not mourn in public. He simply did what he had learned to do. He stayed useful. There were practical matters, meetings to attend, debts to settle, disputes to prevent, men to reassure, men to warn. Bumpy had been a centre of gravity. Without him, everyone felt lighter and more dangerous. In the days after, Frank moved through rooms where people spoke in lower tones than usual. He listened, he took mental notes, he watched who offered solutions and who offered problems. A younger captain, eager and loud, tried to push an idea too fast. He wanted to expand in a way that sounded impressive and careless at the same time. Frank let him talk, then asked a simple question. Who is going to keep the peace while you do that breach? The captain frowned. He did not like being challenged. We will handle it, the captain said. Frank nodded slowly. He kept his voice calm. Peace is not something you handle, Frank said. Peace is something you maintain, like a suit. If you do not keep it clean, it starts to smell and people notice. A couple of men chuckled, not because it was hilarious, but because the captain needed to be reminded that he was not the only voice in the room. Frank did not enjoy embarrassing anyone. He simply understood that after a king disappears, the loudest men often try to sing first. Loud singing attracts attention, and attention was not a friend. Harlem had other forces watching. The Italian crews did not vanish just because Bumpy did. They had their own rhythms, their own boundaries, their own pride. They wanted stability, not because they loved peace, but because they loved profit. Frank knew that stability was the only safe currency. He had to show the neighborhood and the outsiders that the machine still ran, that the lights would stay on, that the deals would stay on, and that the street would not erupt into a messy scramble that invited the police to take notes. So Frank did what he did best. He organized without appearing to organize. He met with key people quietly, in barbershops, in back rooms, in apartments where the curtains stayed drawn. He asked questions that sounded casual but carried weight. What do you need to stay steady? What do you need to stay loyal? What do you need to stay quiet? He also listened for fear. Fear was a useful signal, but it could not drive the bus. Fear made people panic. Panic made mistakes. Mistakes made headlines. Frank had no interest in headlines. He began to reduce the number of hands touching the money. He began to treat the operation like a business that could be audited by God, the police, and jealous neighbors all at once. He did not announce changes. He just made them. Some men resisted. Middlemen often resist anything that makes them less important. They protest like they are defending tradition, when they are really defending their paycheck. A man who had been used to taking a cut from every transaction confronted Frank one night. He was not stupid, but he was proud, and pride can make a smart man act like a fool. You think you can just cut me out? The man said. Frank did not raise his voice. He did not smile. I do not think it, Frank said. I am doing it. The man's face tightened. He leaned forward, trying to turn his body into an argument. That is not how things work, he said. Frank nodded once, like he was agreeing with a child about the weather. Things work however they work, Frank said. And right now they work better without extra hands in the pot. The man stared, waiting for fear. Frank gave him none. Finally the man stood up, muttering. He did not make a scene. He understood that scenes were expensive. When he was gone, one of Frank's younger runners exhaled. You are cold, the runner said. Frank looked at him, and for a moment his expression softened. I am not cold, Frank said. I am tired of waste. Humour, when it came, was dry. It came from watching men pretend they were principled while arguing over percentages. It came from watching grown adults behave like children around money, and then demand to be respected as leaders. Frank respected competence. He respected discipline. He respected loyalty when it was real. He did not respect performance. As weeks passed, the neighborhood began to adjust. People started to treat Frank as a center of gravity. They came to him with problems. They came to him with requests. They came to him with gossip. They came to him with fear dressed up as friendly advice. Frank did not become a king in a single day. He became a manager of outcomes. He became a man people depended on. which is always a dangerous thing to be. The police presence also shifted. It was subtle at first. A patrol car parked a little longer at the corner, a plainclothes officer who suddenly started buying newspapers from the same vendor every day, a face Frank did not recognize, appearing twice, then 3 times, in places where faces usually changed. Frank noticed. Of course he noticed. He tightened the operation again. He reminded people to keep conversations short and boring. He reminded them that being flashy was a hobby for people who did not plan to stay free. One evening, Frank walked along Lenox Avenue under streetlights that buzzed softly. The air smelled like hot pretzels and exhaust. A couple argued on a stoop, then made up quickly because nobody liked going to bed angry when the city was already unpredictable. Frank passed them and kept walking. He felt the stone in his pocket again, the old memory from Grange. It had not grown lighter over the years, but it had changed shape. It was no longer just pain, it was fuel. At a corner, a man approached him with a cautious smile. The man had connections. He also had a mouth that could get him in trouble. "They say you are next," the man said. Frank looked at him. "Next for what?" The man blinked, unsure if Frank was joking. "Next for, the top." Frank tilted his head slightly. "I am not next," Frank said. "I am already here. People are just catching up." The man laughed, then realized Frank had not. The laugh died quickly. Frank let him walk away with his dignity intact. He did not need to take it. He had bigger concerns than petty victories. That night, Frank sat by his half-stuck window again, listening to Harlem breathe. He thought about Bumpy, about what the old man had built, and about what the old man had protected. Frank did not romanticize the work. He knew what it cost. He knew what it did to families, to streets, to minds. He had seen too much to pretend it was harmless. But he also knew that Harlem had always been forced to survive inside systems that did not care if it lived or died. Frank's morality was not clean. It was practical. It was shaped by history, hunger, and the cold mathematics of staying alive. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and looked into the dark room like he was looking at a map. The old guard was gone. The street would pick a new center whether anyone liked it or not. Frank intended to be the man holding the steady line, not because he wanted applause, but because he wanted control, and because in his world control was the closest thing to safety you could buy. Chapter 4: Bangkok Heat and the Pipeline. Travel is supposed to broaden the mind. Sometimes it just confirms what you already feared. Frank Lucas had learned New York. He had learned Harlem. He had learned how to move through crowds without being touched by them. But the business was changing. The neighborhood demanded consistency, and consistency required supply. If you wanted to control the street, you had to control what fed it. Middlemen were a problem. Middlemen added cost. Middlemen added risk. Middlemen also added the kind of loose talk that drifted into the wrong ears. Frank disliked loose talk the way a careful man dislikes open flames. He started thinking in longer lines, not just blocks, but oceans. There were rumors circulating, the kind that traveled faster than proof. People whispered about Southeast Asia, about product moving through routes that were half politics and half opportunity, about soldiers, planes, and the strange economy that grows around a war even if you never see the battlefield. Frank did not pretend to understand all of it. He did not need to. He just needed to understand enough to move without stumbling. When he decided to go, he did not treat it like an adventure. He treated it like a business trip. A grim little vacation where the only souvenir you wanted was leverage. The airport felt like a different country even before he left. Fluorescent lights, tired faces, announcements that sounded cheerful in a way that made Frank suspicious. He moved through it with a plain suit and a plain expression. On the plane, he sat quietly. He watched other passengers fidget, laugh, complain about food. He found it almost funny how people could worry about small discomforts while the world held larger dangers just out of sight. Frank slept in short stretches, not from fear, but from discipline. He wanted to arrive sharp. Bangkok hit him like a warm hand on the face. The heat was not just weather, it was a presence. It wrapped around you, clung to your shirt, and reminded you that you were not in charge. The streets were alive in a different way than Harlem. Motorbikes moved like fish through traffic. Vendors sold food that smelled bright and unfamiliar. The air carried spice, smoke, and river water. Even the sunlight felt busy. Frank kept his movements quiet. New places require more listening and less speaking. He had contacts, of course. Nobody travels across the world on a guess. But contacts were not guarantees. Contacts were introductions to risk. His first meeting took place in a hotel lobby that tried to look luxurious but could not hide the humidicide. A ceiling fan turned lazily, as if it did not believe in working too hard. Men in suits sat in chairs and pretended they were not watching each other. Frank sat with his hands folded, the picture of calm. Inside, he counted exits. He counted faces. He counted time. A man arrived with a friendly smile and the posture of someone used to being obeyed. He had the look of a person connected to the military, or at least connected to people connected to the military. His confidence was polished, like shoes. Frank listened to him talk. The man spoke about routes and reliability without using too many details. He spoke as if he were discussing shipping containers, not poison. It was that kind of conversation, the kind that turns harm into vocabulary. Frank asked question in a careful tone. How do you keep it steady? Who else touches it? What happens when things go wrong? The man answered with a mix of clarity and vagueness. Some answers were direct, some were padded with charm. Frank let the charm wash over him without drinking it. In Bangkok, Frank learned quickly that everyone was performing. The hotel staff performed politeness, the businessmen performed confidence, the soldiers performed authority, even the street vendors performed cheer. Underneath the performance, everyone was looking for advantage. Frank respected that. He did not like it, but he respected it. He travelled beyond Bangkok for meetings that were never labelled as meetings. Drives that moved through countryside where green fields stretched out in a way Harlem never could. Villages where people watched him with curiosity and caution. Places where the language shifted and Frank became even quieter. He heard the phrase Golden Triangle spoken in a way that made it sound like geography and fate at the same time. A region tied to opium production and to a long chain of hands that turned plants into powders and powders into sorrow. Frank did not romanticize it. He saw it as a distant engine, loud and relentless, feeding markets far away. He met people who seemed to be in charge, and people who were clearly not in charge but acted like it anyway. He met men who wore uniforms, and men who wore smiles that were sharper than knives. He met translators and fixers and guides, all of them with their own private math. In one meeting, a man offered Frank tea and talked about trust. The tea was sweet enough to make Frank's teeth ache. Trust is everything, the man said. Frank nodded slowly. Trust is what people say when they want you to stop asking questions, Frank replied. The translator hesitated, unsure how to deliver that line politely. Frank did not care. Politeness was not the goal. Clarity was. The man laughed, surprised, then pleased. You are practical, he said. Frank gave a small shrug. I am tired, Frank said. Practical is what is left. There was light humour in it, but it was true. Frank's ambition was not theatrical. It was exhausted. It came from decades of watching people with power treat other people like furniture. If Frank could cut out middlemen, he could lower costs, he could raise profits. He could also make the operation more predictable. Predictability meant fewer mistakes. Fewer mistakes meant fewer sirens. But cutting out middlemen also meant stepping into a larger game, played by people who did not live on his blocks and did not care about his neighbourhood. People whose consequences arrived by plane. Frank weighed it all. He thought about his crew in Harlem, hungry for stability. He thought about the rising police interest. He thought about the way the neighbourhood could turn on you if you could not keep the supply steady. In the end, he made the choice the way he always did, quietly. He arranged a partnership that promised direct sourcing. He did not believe in perfection. He believed in advantage. If it gave him a better position than his rivals, It was worth the discomfort. Rumors later would inflate the story. People would say Frank had a secret method, a clever trick. People love clever tricks. They love the idea that crime is a magic show and the magician is always smiling. Frank knew the truth was less glamorous. The truth was meetings, logistics, risk, and a constant fear of betrayal. The truth was paperwork disguised as legend. He heard one story even then, a story that would later grow into a myth, something about using military planes, about returning from war zones with hidden cargo. The story was too clean, too cinematic. Frank stored it in his mind as a possibility, not a certainty. He had learned to separate what people said from what people could prove. That skill kept you alive. On his final nights in Bangkok, Frank walked along a street near the river and let the city surround him. Neon lights reflected in water. Music drifted from open doors. The world felt large and strange and indifferent. He thought about Grange again, about the boy who had watched violence and learned that the world could be unfair in a way that felt designed. Frank had left to find a place where he could control his fate. Now he was in a faraway city, trying to control a chain of events that stretched across continents. Control, he realized, was always partial. It was a story you told yourself so you could sleep. On the flight back to New York, he felt the weight of what he had done. No guilt in a clean moral sense, but gravity. Decisions had mass. They pulled other people into their orbit. When he landed, the air felt colder, and the city's smell felt familiar like an old coat. Harlem was waiting, as it always did, ready to reward him and punish him in the same week. Frank returned to his people and kept his expression neutral. He did not announce success. He did not throw a party. He simply began adjusting the machine. Product arrived with greater consistency. Rivals noticed. Customers noticed. Money moved faster. The neighborhood's pulse changed. A new confidence settled in like weather, and with it came a new danger. Visibility. Frank tried to keep things quiet, but success has a sound. It is the sound of nicer cars pulling up, the sound of larger envelopes, the sound of people arguing over bigger numbers like it makes them wise. Frank watched his crew grow more comfortable. Comfort leads to carelessness. Carelessness leads to disaster. Frank reminded them to stay steady, to stay boring, to stay calm. Some listened, some nodded and then did what they wanted. The street has never been short on men who believe rules are for other people. One night, Frank sat with a couple of his closest men in a back room above a storefront. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and warm wood. A fan buzzed in the corner, pushing stale air in circles. Frank spread out papers, not too many, just enough to show structure. He spoke softly. "We do not get loud," Frank said. "We do not get cute. We do not act like we cannot be touched." One man, younger, with quick eyes, grinned. "We are getting paid, though," he said. Frank looked at him, then allowed the smallest hint of a smile. "Yes," Frank said. "That is the most dangerous part." The men laughed quietly. The humor helped, but it did not remove the truth. In Harlem, money was a light. It drew moths, it drew cops, it drew rivals, it drew betrayal. Frank knew the police would eventually connect patterns. They always did. The question was not if, but when. Frank wanted more time. He wanted more distance between himself and the street-level mess. He thought of Bangkok again, the heat and the busy air. He thought of the men who spoke about trust like it was an item you could buy. Frank did not trust anyone fully. He trusted systems, and he trusted his own ability to read a room. That night, alone by his half-stuck window, Frank listened to Harlem breathe and felt the future leaning closer. He had widened his reach. He had strengthened his position. He had also stepped onto a larger stage, whether he liked it or not, and stages come with audiences. Chapter 5: Blue Magic and the Price of Looking Rich. Harlem loved a nickname. Harlem also loved a product that arrived on time, felt consistent, and came with a story that people could repeat without thinking too hard. If the story was clean enough, people could tell it in a barbershop without whispering. If the name was catchy enough, people could say it with a grin, as if they were talking about music instead of trouble. Frank Lucas did not invent human weakness. He did not need to. He simply learned how to package it. After his Southeast Asia trip, the supply line felt steadier than before. The steady flow changed the neighborhood the way a new train line changes a city. People went places they had not gone before. People spent money they did not have. People made plans that sounded confident until the bills arrived. Frank watched all of it like a man watching a field during harvest. You did not get emotional, you got organized. He ran the work like an office that happened to have street corners attached. He wanted fewer hands touching the product. He wanted fewer mouths talking about it. He wanted fewer people making decisions while feeling excited. Excitement is just fear wearing perfume. He picked a small group of men who had discipline, not saints, not philosophers, just men who could show up, keep quiet and follow instructions without needing a speech about loyalty every morning. He also looked for something else. Men who understood timing. In Harlem, timing was more valuable than muscle. Muscle could scare a person for a day. Timing could keep the police bored for a year. Frank used apartments that looked ordinary from the hallway, a tired couch, a radio, a kitchen table with a small stain that would never come out. He liked those places. Ordinary places were invisible. Flashy places came with visitors, and visitors came with opinions. The work was repetitive. Count, sort, wrap, move, pay, count again. He kept it clean as that kind of work could be. A messy operation felt like an invitation. Frank did not like invitations. At night, when the crew gathered around a table, the room often turned quiet in a way that was almost peaceful. Bills stacked in neat piles, rubber bands snapping softly, a man licking his thumb before counting, like he was reading a holy book. Frank sometimes found it funny, in a dry way, that money could make grown men act like librarians. Everyone whispering, everyone careful, everyone suddenly respectful of order. If you wanted men to practice manners, you did not need a preacher. You needed cash. He did not laugh out loud. He saved laughter for safer rooms. But the thought sat in his mind like a small private joke. To keep rivals off balance, Frank leaned into consistency. He wanted customers to believe they were getting the same thing every time. That belief was powerful. It created habits, and habits were harder to break than promises. The name that floated up through the street was Blue Magic. Frank did not stand on a corner and announce it. He let the name spread naturally, the way rumors spread, the way songs spread. The street chose what it liked. Blue Magic sounded almost harmless. It sounded like a card trick. It sounded like something you might see in a nightclub. It did not sound like tragedy. That was the point. Frank understood branding before people started pretending branding was only for soda and sneakers. He understood that if you gave something a name, people would treat it as reliable. If you gave it a reputation, people would protect it, even if they did not understand why. Still, he knew there was a cost. He saw the cost on faces. He saw it in the way a person could look bright one week and dim the next. He saw families fray. He saw conversations turn into arguments. He saw good intentions collapse under the weight of daily need. Frank did not speak about it much. Speaking about it would not fix it. And in his world, speaking about feelings was often mistaken for weakness, or worse, an invitation to manipulate you. But he noticed. He carried it quietly. His rationalization was not pretty. It was practical. Harlem had been treated like a problem long before Frank arrived. The city took from Harlem, jobs disappeared, landlords collected rent like they were collecting tribute, and the police arrived late to help and early to punish. Frank told himself he was taking a share back. He told himself he was feeding his people. He told himself he was building something stable in a world that offered instability as a lifestyle. Sometimes late at night he suspected he was lying to himself. He did not let that suspicion show. Frank built routines, meetings in back rooms, money drops that happened on schedule, deliveries that moved like clockwork. The more predictable the machine, the less likely it was to rattle. He also built distance between himself and the street-level mess. He did not like being close to the corners. Corners came with noise. Corners came with little conflicts that grew into bigger ones. Corners came with police cars rolling slow, officers staring like they had nothing better to do. Frank preferred quiet rooms and careful lists. He spent money, but he tried to spend it strategically. He helped certain people with rent. He paid for funerals when families were desperate. He handed cash to an older woman who ran a small business and needed a repair. He did not do it for applause. He did it because generosity can be a form of insurance, and because Frank did not like to feel like a monster. The neighborhood noticed anyway. People always notice when money flows. They might not know the details, but they know the temperature change, and with attention came the temptation to show off. Frank did not like show-offs. Show-offs made work harder, but even Frank could be pulled by the gravity of visibility, if only for a night. The story later told by many people, and repeated like a legend, was about a boxing match at Madison Square Garden. A big event, bright lights, famous faces, and cameras hungry for moments. Frank went, wearing a chinchilla coat that looked like it belonged on a king, not on a man trying to stay unnoticed. He had a reason, of course. He told himself it was harmless. He told himself it was just a coat. He told himself he deserved a little warmth and a little style in a city that often felt cold. Also, he told himself he was paying for his own seat. It was his money. That was a very human thought, and it was also the beginning of trouble. The garden had a particular smell: popcorn, beer, sweat, perfume, anticipation. The crowd buzzed like a power line. People talked fast, laughed too loud, and looked around to see who else was looking. Frank walked in with his crew, and the coat did what coats like that do. It announced itself. It did not need words. In a place full of suits and winter jackets, the fur looked like a billboard. Frank felt eyes turn. Some eyes were impressed. Some were jealous. Some were simply curious, because curiosity is free and people spend it carelessly. Frank sat down, and for a moment he enjoyed it. The lights, the roar, the feeling of being part of something big that was not directly connected to the daily grind of Harlem corners. He watched the ring, the fighters, the ceremony. He let the noise wash over him. Then he saw it. A look from a man a few rows away. Not a fan, not a tourist. A look with professional interesting. Frank had seen that look before. He had seen it in the eyes of cops who were trying to decide if you were trouble. He had seen it in the eyes of men who were calculating whether you were a target. The man was not wearing a uniform. He did not need one. The posture gave him away, the calm attention, the habit of scanning faces, the way he did not get carried away by the crowd. Frank turned his gaze back to the ring. He kept his expression relaxed, but inside, a small alarm bell rang. He had just introduced himself to an audience he did not want. After the match, as people poured out into the cold night, Frank moved with the crowd. He did not rush, he did not run, he did not look over his shoulder too often. Looking over your shoulder too often is like raising your hand in class and saying you have something to hide. He got into a car and left. The coat remained bright in his mind, not as a luxury, but as a mistake. Back in Harlem, he tightened things again. He reminded his men not to dress like they were trying to get noticed. He reminded them that a loud outfit could be as dangerous as a loud mouth. One of the younger men complained, "But we are winning," he said. "We should look like it." Frank gave him a tired look. "If you look like you are winning," Frank said, "somebody comes to check your math." The men laughed softly. The younger man nodded, even if he did not fully understand. Frank also started thinking more carefully about law enforcement. Not the patrol guys who wanted an easy arrest, but the investigators who wanted a case. Frank knew the difference. A patrol officer could be delayed with small talk or a small favor. An investigator was a slow storm. You could not bribe the weather. He began using more layers, more separation, more distance. He set rules about who could speak to whom. He insisted on short conversations and simple instructions. He avoided phones when he could. He treated every new person like a possible leak, because every new person was. Still, the money kept growing. Cash has a way of multiplying, and also a way of creating new problems. People with cash start to believe the world is stable. They start to gamble. They start to argue. They start to forget the rules that brought them there. Frank watched his crew develop small cracks. A man began to talk too much, enjoying the attention of women at bars. A man began to use product, believing he could handle it. A man began to gamble too hard, and then look at the operation like it could solve his debts. Frank did not like these shifts. They meant danger. They meant sloppiness. They meant human weakness. The thing Frank had always counted on in others, now showing up inside his own house. He handled it quietly. He moved Dan Man away from certain duties. He warned another man with a calm talk that sounded almost like a father speaking to a stubborn son. He arranged help for a man who was sliding, not because Frank was soft, but because Frank did not like waste. He also kept his family close. The story of Frank is often told like he was made only of ambition, but he was also made of routine. He had people he cared for, and the care softened him in private, even if he stayed hard in public. At home, the noise of Harlem faded. Meals happened. Conversations happened. Small domestic annoyances happened. A child being picky about food. A spouse asking why he came home late. Frank sitting at a table, listening, nodding, pretending to be fully present while his mind ran numbers in the background. Sometimes he caught himself doing it, and felt a flicker of shame. He did not want to be a ghost in his own house, so he practiced a different kind of control at home. He listened more, he smiled more, he told small jokes, not the kind of jokes that made people roar, but the kind that made them breathe out. One night, after dinner, he stood by his window again and watched the streetlights glow. The city looked calm from above. Down on the sidewalk it was never calm. Frank thought about the coat. He thought about the eyes in the crowd. He thought about the way success changes your posture. You sit differently. You walk differently. You believe you are untouchable, and that belief is the first thing that gets touched. He had built a powerful machine. The street had a name for his product. Rivals were nervous, customers were loyal, money was steady. But the police had eyes, the police had patience, and now the police had a story. A man in a chinchilla coat at Madison Square Garden does not vanish easily from memory. Frank finished his coffee, set the cup down, and spoke softly to the empty room, as if the walls needed the reminder. "Do not get comfortable," he said. The room did not answer. The city did not answer. But somewhere out there, people were already doing the math. Chapter 6. The Cops Learn the Rhythm. A good investigation is mostly waiting. Waiting in cars, waiting in offices, waiting for someone to make a mistake so small they do not even notice it. Most people imagine police work as fast chases and dramatic confrontations. That image is convenient for movies, and it is also nonsense. Real investigations are paperwork with bad posture. In New York City, a small group of investigators began to pay attention to a pattern in Harlem. The pattern was not flashy. It was a steady change in street behavior, a product that seemed more consistent, a network that seemed more disciplined, a quiet confidence that settled over certain corners like a new set of rules. The investigators were not impressed. They were interested. One of them was Richie Roberts, a detective with the kind of reputation that made some colleagues uncomfortable. He had a habit of doing things by the book, which in some rooms was treated as a personal insult. Richie did not look like a hero from a poster. He looked tired. He looked observant. He looked like a man who had watched too many cases fall apart because someone wanted to cut a corner and call it efficiency. He sat in a cluttered office where the coffee tasted like regret. Files stacked in uneven piles, a calendar that was never updated, phones that rang at the worst moments. The city poured problems onto his desk like it was feeding a hungry animal. On a winter morning, Richie listened to a briefing that sounded like many others. Men around a table, cigarette smoke clinging to their clothes, a supervisor speaking in the tone of someone trying to sound energetic while dying inside. "Harlem," the supervisor said. "Same old mess, but something is different." Richie wrote notes in a small notebook, not because he loved notes, but because memory is unreliable and the job punishes arrogance. "What is different?" Richie asked. "Cleaner product," man said. "People are calling it Blue Magic." Richie raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like a brand," he said. Exactly, another man replied. Someone is treating it like business. Business was the part Richie did not like. Business meant strategy, strategy meant patience, and patience meant longer cases, which meant more chances for someone in your own department to sabotage you out of boredom or greed. Still, Richie leaned in. Who is behind it, he asked. Names floated around. Some were guesses, some were old street legends, some were confident because confidence is free and people love spending it. Then someone mentioned a detail from a recent event at Madison Square Garden. A man in a chinchilla coat, sitting in expensive seats, surrounded by people who looked like they were not there to discuss boxing technique. Richie did not care about the coat for fashion reasons. He cared because it did not match the setting. It was a signal, like a flare shot into the sky. A chinchilla coat is not warm, Richie thought. It is an announcement. He asked for more details. Who saw him? Where he sat? Who he was with? What cars they drove? Which doors they used? The boring stuff that turns into evidence when you stack it correctly. The room sighed a little. People did not love details. Details take work. But Richie insisted. If you want a case, he said, you start with facts, stories. They began. Reports, notes, interviews that were mostly silence. A small list of names. A few photographs taken from a distance, grainy and imperfect. A couple of street sources who talked too much and knew too little. Richie did not complain. This was how it started. A case is not born as a case. It is born as a suspicion. The task force built slowly, in that typical way where nobody wants to admit they are building a task force until they are already sharing desks and arguing over staplers. People from different units, different agencies, different habits. Egos bouncing off each other like pool balls. Richie had seen it before. The first month is mostly arguments about credit. The second month is mostly arguments about jurisdiction. Somewhere around the third month, if you are lucky, someone remembers that the point is stopping the flow. Richie sat with an agent from a federal unit, a man who dressed well and spoke like he was always presenting a case to a judge. The agent had a careful voice and a habit of repeating himself as if repetition made things true. We need the supplier, the agent said. Not it's the street guys. Richie nodded. We need the structure, Richie replied. Money, routes, communication. The agent leaned back. And we need someone to make a mistake, he said. Richie did not smile, but his eyes did. They always do, Richie said. The trick is being there when it happens. They set up surveillance in Harlem, nat dramatic. Just cars parked where they blended in, which in New York City is its own kind of art. A car that blends in is a car that looks like it has been ignored for years. Officers sat in those cars with cold hands and warm frustration. They watched corners. They watched people walk in circles, pretending they were not watching each other. They ate sandwiches that made them sad. They drank coffee that made them jittery. They listened to radios that never said anything helpful until the moment you were in the restroom. Richie did his share of sitting. He watched faces. He watched routines. He watched the rhythm of the operation. The thing about organized street work is that it has a beat. The same people appear at the same times. The same cars arrive, stay for a minute, leave. The same apartments receive visitors at odd hours. The same small gestures repeat. Richie liked patterns. Patterns were honest. He also noticed what was missing. There was not much chaos, not much public argument, not many flashy displays. Whoever ran this operation valued control. That narrowed the field. Richie dug into financial details where he could. He asked questions about property, about cars, about where money might be parked in plain sight. He looked for unusual purchases, unusual routines, unusual moments of confidence. Confidence is the crack in the wall. It is where the water gets in. He heard the name Frank Lucas more than once, not always as the main subject, but as a shadow behind the conversation. Some people said Frank was Bumpy Johnson's guy. Some people said Frank was the new man. Some people said Frank was just a rumor, and rumors are often a way to hide the truth from yourself. Richie did not trust street talk. He used it as a map, not a destination. He asked for background. A man from North Carolina. Harlem connections. Known associates. A couple of arrests on minor matters, the kind that never tell the full story. The outline of a life that could become a case if the right pieces lined up. The task force started collecting those pieces. They flipped low-level people when they could, not with screaming threats, but with quiet conversations in small rooms. The kind of rooms where the air feels stale and the chairs feel like they were designed to punish honesty. Richie sat across from a young man who had been caught with product. The young man tried to act tough, but his hands gave him away. Hands always tell the truth if you watch long enough. "You are not built for prison," Richie said calmly. The young man sneered. "You do not know me," he said. Richie nodded. "That is true," Richie replied. "But I know fear, and it is sitting right next to you." The young man swallowed. Richie continued, voice steady. "Here is what I can do. I can write you up as a small part of a big problem, and you will carry the big problem on your back. Or you can help me understand the big problem, and maybe you go home sooner than you think." The young man stared at the table. He did not answer right away. Richie did not rush him. Silence is a tool. If you use it correctly, it does the work for you. Eventually the young man talked. Not everything, not the full story, but enough to confirm structure, enough to confirm layers, enough to confirm that whoever ran it had discipline. Richie left the room feeling two things at once. Satisfaction, because a thread had been found. Sadness, because the thread belonged to a kid who had already been swallowed by the street. At night, Richie went home to a small apartment that did not feel like a victory. He took off his jacket, loosened his tie, and sat quietly for a moment, listening to the silence. He wondered, as he often did, where the city ended and the job began. In New York, the line was thin. Back in Harlem, Frank Lucas was also listening. He felt the shift. Not a siren, not a raid, not a headline, just the sense that the air had changed. People on corners were more cautious. Cars lingered longer than they used to. A face appeared twice in the same week, and it was not a face that belonged to the neighborhood. Frank responded by tightening the machine again. Shorter meetings, fewer phone calls, more distance, more reminders. One of his men complained. Again, because men always complain when you ask them to be disciplined. "We are making money," the man said. "Why are you acting like we are losing?" Frank looked at him with a calm that felt almost gentle. "Because the city does not let you win forever," Frank said. "The city changes the rules when it gets bored." That was Frank's dark humor. Not a joke exactly, but a truth delivered with a hint of sarcasm. The men laughed softly because laughter made fear feel smaller. Meanwhile, the task force kept building. They watched a stash apartment from across the street for days. Nothing happened. Then everything happened in 10 minutes. A man arrived with a bag. Another man arrived and left quickly. A car rolled up, stayed for a moment, drove away. Richie recorded times, wrote down plate numbers, and watched faces through binoculars that made his eyes ache. He did not get dramatic about it. He just collected. Evidence is a pile. You do not notice it growing until it becomes heavy. The task force also had to deal with internal problems. Corruption in the city was not a rumor, it was a constant background noise. Richie knew that if the wrong person got wind of what they were doing, the operation they were watching would tighten up even more, or disappear, or set up a trap. Richie did not trust many people. He trusted process. He trusted documentation. He trusted making sure that every step could be explained later, because later is where court happens. One afternoon, a supervisor tried to push Richie to move faster. "We need results," the supervisor said. "We need arrests. The press is asking questions." Richie looked up from his notes. "The press is always asking questions," Richie said. "They do not like waiting." The supervisor frowned. "And you do," Richie paused, then answered with tired honesty. "I do not like waiting," Richie said. "I like winning. Waiting is the price." The supervisor left, not satisfied, but unable to argue with the logic. Weeks passed. The task force gathered more threads. A courier here, a money man there, a pattern of phone calls, when they could get it, a routine of car trips across town, a sense of where the money slept at night. Richie kept the chinchilla coat in mind as a symbol, not because he cared about fashion, but because it revealed something about Frank Lucas. It revealed pride. Pride is not always loud, but it is always heavy. Pride makes you take risks for no practical reason. Pride makes you want to be seen. Richie knew that if Frank Lucas enjoyed being seen once, he might do it again, and if he did it again, he might do it in a way that left a mark. As winter moved along, Harlem carried on. People still worked, people still laughed, people still tried to be normal in a city that did not reward normal. Frank kept his machine running, Richie kept watching it. Two men in the same city, moving in opposite directions, tied together by a pattern neither of them could fully control. On a cold night, Richie sat in a surveillance car and watched a building where nothing happened. His partner yawned. "You ever think about doing something easier?" his partner asked. Richie stared out the windshield. "If I wanted easy," Richie said, "I would sell hot dogs." His partner laughed, then sighed. Richie did not laugh. He simply watched. The streetlight flickered. A pedestrian passed, a car turned the corner, and somewhere behind curtains the machine kept turning. Chapter 7. Teaneck, Suitcases, and the Sound of Boots or Stairs. Teaneck, New Jersey did not look like Harlem. That was the point. In Harlem, the city was loud even when it tried to whisper. In Teaneck, the streets could feel padded. Lawns were trimmed. Driveways held cars that slept in neat lines. Neighbors waved at each other like they were all part of the same polite agreement. The air smelled less like exhaust and more like wet leaves. Frank Lucas liked Teaneck for the same reason he liked plain apartments and quiet back rooms. It felt ordinary. Ordinary was camouflage. He had chosen a life where the work was always tense, but he still craved calm places to rest his mind. In Teaneck, he could sit in a living room and hear almost nothing. No sirens, no shouting, no late-night arguments floating up from the sidewalk. Just the sound of a refrigerator humming and a distant television in someone else's house. When people talk about power, they usually imagine noise. Frank understood that real power often hides behind quiet curtains. Inside his home, life tried to be normal. Meals happened, family routines happened. A child asked for something sweet before dinner. Someone forgot where the keys were. Someone complained about the weather, as if the weather could be negotiated. Frank tried to be present for those moments. He tried to enjoy them. He was not a machine, even if he ran one. He cared about his family in a way that did not fit neatly into the public story told about him. But the work followed him home anyway, like a smell you cannot wash out of your coat. Money did not sit still. Money needed places to go, places to hide, places to wait. Frank did not trust banks. Banks asked questions, and banks kept records, and records were little paper witnesses that never got tired. Frank preferred cash. Cash was loyal if you treated it right. Cash also had wet, annoying habit. It took up space. In Teaneck there were suitcases, more than one. Some were used for travel, some were used for storage. Suitcases could hold a great deal without looking suspicious, which is funny if you think about it. People see a suitcase and assume vacation. They do not assume accounting. Frank's wife, Julie Farrett, lived inside the same strange contradiction. She was part of the domestic life that wanted normalcy, and she was also part of the life that had to adapt to sudden risk. People later would speak about her like she was a character in a story. The truth was simpler and more human. She was a person trying to survive inside a situation that could change without warning. Frank kept rules at home too, not harsh rules, practical rules. Do not answer questions you do not need to answer. Do not open the door for anyone you do not know. Do not talk on the phone about anything that matters. Do not assume the quiet will last. He did not say those rules with drama. He said them the way a parent reminds a child to look both ways before crossing the street. Still, even with rules, comfort had begun to creep in. The operation in Harlem had been running for a while with a steady pulse. Blue Magic had a reputation. Money moved fast. Rival crews adjusted. Some backed away. Some tried to compete. Some tried to copy. Frank had become, whether he liked it or not, a visible figure in an invisible business. And visibility has consequences. On the law enforcement side, The slow storm had been forming. Investigator had watched, they had written, they had collected threads. They had tried to protect their work from leaks, which in New York was like trying to protect a sandwich from pigeons. Richie Roberts and his colleagues were not looking for a street corner victory. They were building a case. A case is a story told with receipts, and they were collecting receipts. They followed routines, they tracked patterns, they listened to whispers from people who were tired of being small parts of a bigger machine. They compared notes until the notes began to align. What they needed was a clean moment, a moment they could take to court and explain without relying on street poetry. They also needed timing. Raids are often presented as dramatic. In reality, a raid is a plan written down, rehearsed, checked, revised, and executed by people who have learned that excitement is a liability. The goal is not chaos. The goal is control. On a winter day in late January 1975, the plan moved into motion. At Frank's house in Teaneck, the morning started like other mornings. The neighborhood was quiet. The air was cold enough to pinch your lungs. Cars passed occasionally, tires whispering against the road. Inside, the house held the soft signs of regular life. A table, chairs, a kitchen that had been used, clothing folded or not folded depending on who you ask, the normal mess of being human. Frank was not naive. He knew the police might come someday. He had lived with that knowledge like a second heartbeat. But even men who expect storms can be surprised by the exact moment the sky breaks. The first sign was not a siren, it was the sound outside. Not loud, yet. Car doors closing with purpose. Footsteps that did not belong to a neighbor walking a dog. A coordination that felt like the air itself had become organized. Then came the knock. Not a polite knock, a firm knock. The kind of knock that says we are not here to chat. Frank moved fast but not frantic. He had practiced calm for years. Calm was his armor. Julie reacted too. Later stories would describe suitcases being tossed out of a window, money flying like startled birds. The truth, as with most things, was less cinematic and more panicked. In moments like that, people do what they think might help, even if it is messy. Fear makes people creators. Fear also makes people clumsy. Frank's first thought was not heroism, it was arithmetic. What is in the house? What can be found? What can be explained away? What cannot? He had always believed that the most dangerous thing about cash was not the cash itself, it was the volume. A few bills can be shrugged off as savings. A suitcase of bills tells a story you cannot easily edit. The police entered with warrants and procedure. They moved room to room with the practiced rhythm of people who have done it before. They did not need to shout much. The seriousness was already loud. Frank watched them with a face that stayed mostly neutral. He did not rant. He did not plead. He did not try to charm. He observed. There is a strange kind of calm that can settle over a person when the thing they feared finally arrives. The waiting ends. The guessing ends. The mind shifts into a different gear. Richie was not necessarily the first person through the door, but he was part of the machine that brought the door to that moment. If he was there, he would have watched Frank carefully, the way he always watched. If he was not there, he still would have read the reports like they were chapters in a book he had been writing for months. The search produced what searches sometimes produce: evidence, cash, records, items that could be interpreted, items that could be argued over later in courtrooms with polished floors and tired judges. Reports would later say that about $584,000 was seized from the home. That number is famous because it is both huge and simple. It tells the public, even people who do not understand investigations, that something serious was happening. For Frank, it was not a number, it was time. Time spent building the machine, time spent managing risks, time spent believing he could stay ahead. Now the time had been converted into paper evidence. Julie, caught in the same shock, tried to reduce the damage the way a person tries to bail water from a boat in a storm. If cash could be removed, maybe the story would shrink. If suitcases could disappear, maybe the math would become less obvious. But storms do not work like that. Once the police are in your living room, the story has already changed. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, pretending they were not watching. That is how polite suburbs handle chaos. They pretend it is not happening, while memorizing every detail to share later at a safe distance. Frank was taken in. The ride to the station, the processing, the rooms that smelled like disinfectant and stale air, all of it felt like the opposite of Teaneck. No soft quiet, no domestic comfort, just institutional control. Some men in custody talk too much, some go silent. Frank did what he always did. He measured. He knew that at this stage words were dangerous. Every sentence could become a rope. Every denial could become a contradiction. Every angry outburst could become a note in a file about temperament. Frank sat, watched, and spoke only when necessary. He asked for what he needed, and otherwise let the process move. The press started sniffing around. Journalists are like cats when they smell fish. A big case in Harlem, a name that connects to a legend, a raid in a suburban home with suitcases of cash. It was the kind of story that writes itself. Frank hated that part, not because he feared public judgment, but because public attention attracts professional attention. When the public starts watching, agencies start competing. When agencies start competing, the work gets messy. In Harlem, the crew felt the shock immediately. People who had been comfortable became nervous. People who had been reckless suddenly discovered caution. Corners changed hands. Some men ran. Some men tried to act like nothing had happened, which is a very human response and also a very bad strategy. Frank's operation had been disciplined, but no operation is immune to panic. Some of Frank's men wanted to do something loud, a desperate show of strength, a public gesture. Frank was not there to calm them, and that absence created its own danger. But the street has its own survival instincts. Many men chose the quieter path. They went home, they stopped answering phones, they avoided each other, as if friendship were contagious. A few tried to contact lawyers, a few tried to contact Frank's family, a few tried to contact the people who are now watching from the other side of the law. The case moved forward the way cases do. Slowly, then suddenly. Paperwork, hearings, bail arguments, strategies, plea conversations held in tight voices. Frank sat with attorneys and listened to the legal version of his life. In the legal version, you are not a man, you are a pattern, a set of alleged facts, a collection of choices presented in the worst possible light. Frank could respect it in a strange way. He had always believed in systems. The legal system was a system too, even if it was imperfect and sometimes corrupt. He did not respect the moral performance that sometimes came with it. People who had ignored Harlem for years suddenly spoke about protecting Harlem. People who had tolerated corruption suddenly spoke about purity. Frank saw the hypocrisy and almost smiled. Almost. In the courthouse corridors, he saw faces he recognized from the street, now wearing their best clothes and looking nervous. He saw people who had once treated him like a king, now treating him like a risk they wanted to avoid. That part did sting. Not because Frank expected loyalty from everyone, he did not, but because the speed of betrayal can still surprise you even when you expect it. Julie had her own journey through the storm. Being the spouse of a public case is its own punishment. People stare, people judge, people ask questions that are really accusations. She had to protect her children, protect herself, and protect whatever remained of their private life. Frank watched her carry that weight and felt something he rarely let rise to the surface. Regret. Not regret for the money, not regret for ambition. Regret for what the ambition demanded from the people closest to him. He kept that regret quiet. Quiet regret is the kind that keeps you awake at night. As the days turned into weeks, Frank found a new kind of calm. He could not control the street now, he could not control the supply line, he could not control what the newspapers printed, but he could still control himself. He sat in holding rooms and listened to distant sounds, doors closing, keys turning, voices echoing. He thought about Grange, he thought about Harlem, he thought about Bumpy's rule. Control yourself, control the room. The room was larger now. The room was the system. Frank did not know exactly how it would end yet, but he understood one thing with absolute clarity. The quiet suburban curtain had been pulled back, and everyone was staring. Chapter 8. Courtrooms and Witness Protection. A courthouse is a strange place to chase truth. It is built like a temple, but it runs like an office. It has grand entrances and small waiting rooms. It has people speaking in formal tones while carrying petty grudges. It has rules that are supposed to make everything fair, and it has human beings who are very good at bending rules without breaking them. Frank Lucas walked into that world carrying the weight of headlines and rumors. He wore a suit, because a suit is a kind of armor. He kept his face calm, because emotion is a kind of evidence. The case against him was not only about him. It was about what he represented. A large operation. A public symbol. A moment when law enforcement wanted to show that the city could still draw lines and enforce them. Richie Roberts watched the process with the tired patience of a man who knows that winning in court is different from winning on the street. On the street, you win by showing strength. In court, you win by showing paperwork. Richie had learned to distrust charisma. Charisma makes juries sleepy. Charisma makes facts blur. He focused on details. He also knew something else. Cases like this attract attention from inside the department. Sometimes that attention is supportive, sometimes it is hungry, sometimes it is dangerous. Corruption was not a distant rumor in New York. It lived close. It sat in offices. It wore badges. It accepted envelopes. It whispered warnings. It leaked information. Richie knew that for a case to stick, it had to be clean. He could not control every officer. He could not control every agency. But he could control his own work. He could control documentation. He could control procedure. So he did what he always did. He treated the case like it would be examined by enemies, because it would. Frank, on the other hand, faced a legal machine that did not care about his origin story. The court did not care about Grange. It did not care about the boy who watched unfairness carve a scar into his mind. It cared about evidence, statutes, and outcomes. Frank listened as attorneys described him in clinical terms. He listened to arguments about money, about patterns, about intent. He listened to his name spoken in rooms where people mispronounced Harlem street names and still acted like experts. There was a small bit of humor in that. People who never walked those blocks spoke about those blocks like they owned them. Frank kept that humor inside. Laughing in court is a luxury for people who are not the main subject. The sentence that hovered over him was enormous. A kind of number so large it feels unreal until it becomes your calendar. It was the sort of sentence that turns a person into a cautionary tale. Frank felt anger about it, of course. Anger is human. But anger alone does not change outcomes. Frank understood that he needed strategy, not rage. He also understood another truth. The system loved a deal. Deals are the hidden engine of courtrooms. Prosecutors want convictions. Defendants want reduced time. Judges want the docket to move. Everyone wants the machine to keep turning. The rhetoric is about justice, but the work is often about efficiency. Frank had spent years cutting deals in his own world. Now he was on the other side of the table, facing a different kind of negotiation. The question became simple, even if the answer was not. What do you offer? In cases like this, cooperation is the currency. Names, routes, methods, connections. Not rumors, not street poetry, specifics that can be verified. Frank faced a moral puzzle that was not clean. He was not deciding between good and evil. He was deciding between survival and loyalty, between time and pride. Some people will tell you loyalty is everything. Those people usually say it when they want you to sacrifice yourself for their comfort. Frank had been loyal to Bumpy. He had been loyal to his crew when they served the machine. But he also knew that many of the people who claimed loyalty would disappear the moment it became expensive. He had already seen it. So Frank made a choice that would shape the rest of his story. He cooperated. The public loves to debate that choice. Some say it was betrayal, some say it was survival, some say it was both. Frank did not frame it as philosophy. He framed it as math. If you face a lifetime behind bars, you start to consider new calculations. His cooperation helped law enforcement. It also made him a target, not only from the street, but from anyone who felt exposed by the information he provided. Frank knew that in his world, Information is a knife, even if nobody holds it openly. This is where the story takes on a quieter kind of tension. Witness protection is often imagined like a disguise and a new haircut. In reality, it is isolation. It is rules that shrink your world. It is silence that becomes a habit. It is living in a place where you do not belong and pretending you do, day after day. Frank was given a path that reduced his sentence. The big number became smaller. Not small, but survivable. The system, in return, took pieces of the larger network. That was the bargain. Richie watched this with mixed feelings. A detective wants justice, but a detective also wants results, and results sometimes come through compromises that feel unsatisfying. In a hallway outside a courtroom, Richie saw Frank being moved by officers. Frank's posture was steady. Richie studied him the way he studied everyone, looking for emotion that might leak out. Frank met his eyes briefly. No hate, no fear, just recognition. Two professionals, in a strange way. Richie spoke to him quietly as they passed, not as a threat, more like a remark. "You could have kept the coat in the closet," Richie said. Frank almost smiled. "You could have stayed home," Frank replied. Richie did not laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to friendly banter that a courthouse would allow. Then they were separated by doors and duty. Frank's family paid a separate price. Julie and the children had to adapt to the public story and the private fear. Friends became cautious. Neighbors became curious. The phone rang with voices that sounded supportive and felt like probes. Moving under witness protection meant losing the parts of identity that are taken for granted. Your name, your routines, your familiar grocery store, your favorite corner, the ability to be seen without being tracked. Frank, who had built his identity on control, now had to accept a life controlled by others. That kind of acceptance is not peaceful. It is a daily battle with your own pride. He moved to new places, places where the air smelled different and the pace of the street did not match Harlem. He walked into diners where nobody knew his name and felt both relief and loneliness. He learned to be quiet in a new way. Not the quiet of a man planning an operation, but the quiet of a man avoiding being recognized. At times, he tried to create normal habits. He read newspapers, he watched television, he exercised, he sat in small rooms and listened to the wind outside like it was a new kind of siren. But the old habits followed him like shadows. A man like Frank does not stop thinking systems. He does not stop noticing patterns. He does not stop scanning rooms for exits. Even in safety, his mind stayed on patrol. There was also the bitter reality that witness protection does not erase your past, it only moves it. Your past still lives in you. It still wakes up with you. It still shows up in the way you react when a car slows down near your house. Frank would later be released, but during this phase the question was not just when he would get out. The question was who he would be when he did. Time inside the system does not only punish, it changes a person. It grinds down some parts and hardens others. It forces you to sit with your thoughts long enough that they stop being dramatic and start being honest. Frank had plenty of thoughts. He thought about Bumpy, about the old man's calm, about how Bumpy had navigated a world that punished black men for existing and then punished them again for surviving. He thought about Harlem, about the streets, the voices, the daily life that continued without him, as if he had never mattered. He thought about the people harmed by the product he moved, not as abstract statistics, but as faces. A young man with a dull stare, a mother with tired eyes, a neighborhood with too many funerals and not enough jobs. Frank did not turn into a saint. He did not become a poet of regret, but the thoughts arrived anyway, because a human mind does not shut off simply because it prefers not to feel. There was also light humor, the kind that appears even in grim places. In Nen's safe house, Frank was told to keep a low profile. The agent delivering the instruction spoke like a school principal. "Do not draw attention," the agent said. Frank looked around at the small bland room, the generic furniture, the curtains that looked chosen by someone who hates personality. "If I draw attention here," Frank said, "it will be a miracle." The agent did not laugh. Frank did, quietly. Sometimes you laugh because the alternative is to scream. Another time, Frank tried to buy groceries and realized he had no feel for normal prices anymore. In Harlem, money had moved in stacks. Here it moved in small bill and coins, and the cashier looked at him like he was from another planet. Frank apologized, paid, and walked out with a bag of ordinary food, milk, bread, eggs, the basic building blocks of a life that is supposed to be simple. He found that simplicity strangely hard. In the end, the courtroom phase closed the way chapters often close, not with a satisfying moral, but with a door locking and a calendar starting. The system had spoken. A deal had been made. A new life had been assigned like a uniform. Frank, once a man who controlled a network across neighborhoods and oceans, now had to learn how to control a much smaller territory, his own patience. Chapter 9. The second fall is smaller but sharper. Freedom does not always arrive with trumpets. Sometimes it arrives as a guard unlocking a door with the same board motion he used yesterday. Sometimes it arrives as a bus ride where nobody knows your history. Sometimes it arrives as a paper saying you can go, signed by people who never met you. When Frank Lucas stepped back into the world, he did not feel young. Time had worked on him the way water works on stone, slow and steady. His joints complained more, his breath was not as easy. The mirror told the truth even on days when he did not ask. Old buildings vanished. New glass towers appeared. Corners that once carried his name now belonged to different crews, different codes, different arguments. Some old storefronts were gone, replaced by places that sold coffee with complicated names. Harlem had changed too. Some blocks looked tired, some were trying to look new. Faces were both familiar and foreign, a mix of people who remembered the old days and people who treated the old days like folklore. Frank moved through it like a ghost with a body. He had memories attached to corners that no one else could see. He tried to keep his expectations modest. The days of big cars in long lines and stacks of cash on tables were over. The machine he had built was gone, dismantled by raids, deals, and time. Rivals had died, vanished, or reinvented themselves. Frank tried something that sounded simple and turned out to be hard. He tried to live a regular life. Regular, however, is a complicated word for a man used to living at extremes. He spoke with people about legitimate work. He talked about advising youth, maybe doing something like outreach. He considered using his name as a cautionary tale, a way to earn a small income from telling the story of what not to do. There were people who wanted that. Interviewers, writers, curious students with tape recorders. They came with questions that were half academic and half gossip. Frank sat across from them sometimes, wearing a plain shirt, talking about his past in a voice that tried not to glamorize it. He spoke about choice, about consequence, about systems that push and persons who pull. He also noticed the way their eyes brightened when he mentioned certain details. The coat, the trips, the money. People said they wanted a warning. What they often wanted was a thrill they could consume safely, like a movie. Frank understood. He had watched the same impulse in Harlem years before, the way people leaned in when someone told a story about danger. He tried to keep his tone steady, adding small dry jokes as armor. The first time I got rich, he would say, I did not know what to do with a quiet day. They would laugh, he would shrug. The truth in the joke was simple. Some men become addicted to noise, to tension, to the feeling of being at the center of a storm. Frank was fighting that addiction as much as any other. Freedom came with other problems too. Bills do not care about your legend, rent shows up on time, food has its own schedule, medical needs begin to speak louder as the body ages. The world expects you to participate in its economy, even if your resume is mostly made of sealed files. Frank had children who needed him in different ways. Some needed stability, some needed distance. Being a father after years away is like joining a play halfway through. You know your lines from the script in your head, but the other actors have grown up without you. He tried anyway. There were small domestic details that felt almost comic in their contrast with his former life. Sitting in a clinic waiting room flipping through old magazines, standing in line at a supermarket with a plastic basket instead of a suitcase, Asking a clerk about a discount and realizing he honestly cared. It was humbling. It was also strangely peaceful when he let it be. But the past has a long shadow. Old contacts did not vanish. They called, sometimes directly, sometimes through people who thought they were being subtle. They offered opportunities that sounded like shortcuts. "Frank, I got something for you. Frank, it is not like before. Frank, you just have to make introductions." Temptation did not arrive like a big speech. It arrived like a favor, like a chance, like a way to smooth a rough patch. He told himself no more than once. He meant it in those moments, he truly did. But money pressure has its own voice, especially when it shows up at the same time as pride. Frank had been a boss. He had been the man who made decisions, who gave orders, who had people looking to him. Working small jobs, being told what to do by people younger and less capable, scraped against his sense of self. He tried to ignore it. Some days he succeeded, some days he did not. When whispers of a new scheme reached him, it probably looked harmless in the beginning. Something involving money again, of course. Money was the only language most people ever tried to speak with him. It was not the giant trans-ocean operation of his past. It was smaller, less grand, the kind of thing people might have called petty, if it did not involve prison as a possible ending. It involved substances and distribution again, because the old roads are the easiest to find in the dark. Frank stepped toward it, not with the full energy of his youth, but with enough involvement to cross lines he had already promised himself he would not cross again. There was almost a sad comedy in it. The man who once cut out middlemen now found himself tangled in modest arrangements that did not even have the cold elegance of his earlier work. Law enforcement, of course, did not forget him. A man like Frank stays on lists. Names circulate. The second time you come up, people pay more attention. His second arrest did not explode like the first. No dramatic suburban raid with suitcases flying. No headlines screaming in giant type. It was smaller, sharper, more efficient, like a surgeon making a precise cut. Yet the personal impact was brutal. In custody again, Frank felt older in a way he could not laugh about. The first time, he had faced the system as a man in his prime, with energy and a twisted kind of confidence. The second time, he faced it as someone who had already lived through that cycle, and still walked back into it. "You again," the system seemed to say. He received another sentence, not as long as the original legendary number, long enough to matter, long enough to remind him that the world expected him to learn a lesson the first time. Inside again, his body, now more fragile, felt every routine more deeply. Hard mattresses, long waits, medical care that arrived late, the noise in the tears, the smell of disinfectant that never quite beat the other smells. He saw younger men around him, full of that restless energy he once carried. Some of them recognized his name. They spoke about him with a curiosity that made him feel both flattered and tired. "So you are Frank," one said. Frank looked at him and answered quietly. "I used to be," he said. That line carried more truth than the young man understood. He told a few of them what he had started telling interviewers, that the story they thought they admired came with costs they did not see. He described hospitals, funerals, families broken, years carved out of living and handed to institutions. The young men listened, some politely, some skeptically, some with genuine attention. Whether it stuck was another question. Warnings have to compete with glamour, and glamour is loud. Frank did his time. This round felt slower. His bones hurt. His sleep was lighter. Memories visited more often, and not just the ones he would have chosen. He thought of Grange, the very beginning. He thought of Bumpy walking into rooms like the air belonged to him. He thought of the Teaneck living rooms. He thought of Julie and the weight she had carried. He thought of all the small moments when he could have turned left instead of right. That is how regret works. It does not focus on the big decisions, the ones that make headlines. It focuses on the smaller ones that seemed harmless at the time. Eventually he was released again, another door opening, another script telling him to begin again, at an age when most people are planning retirement dinners, not fresh starts. This time, the idea of going back to crime felt absurd. His body could not handle the stress. His mind, weathered by years of side effects and confinement, leaned more toward reflection than action. He moved slower. He spoke softer. The city looked even more changed than before. New shops, new slang, new music, old problems dressed in new clothes. He remained a figure that people occasionally sought out. Reporters, film people, writers, detectives who had retired and wanted to revisit their trophies or their failures. They came with notebooks, microphones, film crews. He gave interviews here and there. His story became an object, a thing to be shaped and sold. He knew that and did not pretend otherwise. He tried to steer it when he could, to cut down the romantic nonsense and add in some weight. I did what I did, he would say. I paid, others paid more. The second fall had cut away what was left of his illusions. If he had once believed in invincibility, that belief was gone. All that remained was a man in late middle age, then old age, who had to live with both the power he once held and the harm that followed. Freedom after the second sentence felt different. Less like a new beginning, more like borrowed time. He spent that borrowed time mostly quiet. Smaller apartments, less travel, more doctors, less bravado. He watched the city from windows instead of from the center of its noise. The spotlight that had once tempted him now felt too bright. He preferred lamps, and in the background, as always, Harlem went on living. Chapter 10. Myth, Memory, and the Last Page Turning. In the final stretch of a life, people often become curators of their own story. They pick details, polish them, arrange them on a mental shelf. They tell some parts often, they bury others deep. They argue with the world about what should be remembered. Frank Lucas was no different. By the time he reached older age, his body made more decisions than he did. Knees that used to climb stairs now negotiated with them. Hands that used to count piles of cash now shook slightly when he held a cup. Sleep came in short shifts, interrupted by old noises only he could hear. The world around him had changed so much that the years of his rule in Harlem felt like a distant film. And then, one day, the world put that film on an actual screen. A movie based loosely on his story hit theaters. The title did not use his name, but the character at its center looked suspiciously familiar. The plot followed some of his life, some of the legends, some of the rumors that had grown taller with each retelling. Actors played roles that were inspired by real people. Scenes showed a version of Harlem that was half memory, half imagination. The chinchilla coat walked across the screen, brighter than any actual coat had ever been. The product from overseas moved with dramatic flourish. Frank watched the film, or at least pieces of it. He watched an actor put on his mannerisms like a costume. He watched scenes of violence softened for ratings but still louder than his own memories. He watched his story turned into entertainment. He had complicated feelings about it. On one hand, the attention fed his ego. It is hard to deny that. To have a life so dramatic that people write scripts about it is a strange kind of immortality. On the other hand, the film could never fully show the cost. No movie can capture the boredom of long nights waiting for nothing, the smell of fear in cramped rooms, the way grief feels in quiet kitchens. Audiences lean in for excitement and lean back from slow pain. Frank did some press around that time, interviews, sound bites, appearances on television, where hosts asked questions that were a blend of curiosity and performance. Did you really do that? Was it really like that? How much of the movie is true? He answered as best he could, sometimes dodging, sometimes correcting. Movies are movies, he would say. Real life has less music. He tried to shift focus sometimes from guns and money to systems and history. He spoke in his own way about racism, poverty, crooked cops, unfair chances. About how a boy from Grange ended up running a shadow economy because the official economy had little room for him. He did not excuse himself. He framed himself. There is a difference. Still, the legend grew. People debated him online, in barbershops, in think pieces. Some called him a genius of strategy. Some called him a predator. Some called him both. Some young people, far removed from his era, wore his name like a brand on shirts, not fully understand the sadness attached. Frank in private saw the absurdity in that. If they want to wear something, he told someone once, they should wear a timesheet from a regular job. That is the real miracle. He kept a small humour about his own myth. It was easier than wrestling with it every day. But life did not pause so he could enjoy or correct his reputation. Bills still arrived, health still declined. The system that had once punished him did not suddenly reward him for telling cautionary stories. He became involved in a smaller fraud later in life, something involving disability payments and paperwork that did not match reality. It felt almost tragic in scale. A man who once handled international routes now tied up in disputes over checks and claims. It showed in a sharp way how narrow his world had become. Grand operations were no longer on the table. Tiny schemes took their place, like a shrinking echo of old habits. He was accused. He faced legal trouble again, not the giant machinery of a drug case, a smaller grinding of bureaucratic wheels. Even so, it added another layer to his story. One more example of how hard it is for some people to live entirely inside the lines once they have spent decades outside them. Age pressed in. Doctors became as common in his schedule as lawyers had once been. Hospitals replaced courtrooms as the main institutional setting in his life. He used a wheelchair at times. The man who had once strode down Lenox Avenue like he owned the pavement now rolled across polished hospital floors pushed by nurses who cared nothing about Harlem law. There is a quiet dignity in that, in being treated as a patient instead of a legend. A blood pressure cuff does not care about your reputation. In those later years, Frank had more time for reflection than action. He talked with family when he could, tried to mend where things were torn, tried to be present even when fatigue pulled him away. Relationships are not easily repaired by late apologies, but late apologies can still matter. He thought about Bumpy Johnson, about how the old man had seemed unshakable until he was gone. Frank now sat on the other side of that feeling, aware that he too one day be a paragraph in some article, a reference in some documentary, a character in some story told by someone who never met him. He wondered which parts would survive. The coat, the name Blue Magic, the Teaneck raid, the cooperation with law enforcement, the second fall, the film, the interviews. He hoped, perhaps quietly, that someone might also remember the human details. The mornings in Harlem before sunrise, the North Carolina boy who watched a world ruled by unfairness, the afternoons in diners where he tried to be normal, the small kindnesses hidden among the harm. Harlem itself moved on, new dealers, new problems, new music out of car windows, old men on corners who remembered Frank sometimes, then went back to their card games. The neighborhood had always been bigger than any man. One day in late spring, in a New Jersey facility, Frank's story reached the page where no more words could be written. His passing was noted in newspapers and on screens. They mentioned his age, they mentioned his crimes, they mentioned his work with authorities. They mentioned the movie because media loves to loop back to media. Some called him infamous, some called him notorious. Some tried for balance, using phrases like complex figure and controversial legacy. For the people who had known him closely, it was simpler. A man they had loved or hated or both was gone. In Harlem, nobody declared a holiday and nobody held a parade. Life continued. Rent was still due. People still stood on corners talking about what was happening today, not 40 or 50 years earlier. A few older folks might have paused, remembering the calm man who once sat on a stoop and watched the street with an accountant's eyes. They might have told a younger person, "You do not know what this block used to be," and the younger person might have nodded politely, already thinking about something else. That is how legacy often works. The world does not stop for your last chapter, it folds it in, like another layer of city dust. Somewhere, a young reader picked up a book about him. Somewhere, a student watched the film and then looked up the real story. Somewhere, a kid from a small town saw in Frank a distorted mirror of his own anger at injustice, and his own hunger for control. If that kid was lucky, there was someone nearby to say, "Listen to the whole story. Look at the full cost. Do not just admire the headline. because that is the quiet moral tucked inside the life of Frank Lucas. He was not a monster from a fairy tale. He was a man built from history, pain, intelligence, and bad choices. He found a way to control a part of the world that had tried to control him, and in doing so he hurt others and himself. He was capable of loyalty and betrayal, of generosity and damage, of discipline and foolish pride. In other words, he was human, only given more power than most and more temptation than many. If there is a gentle lesson to take to bed from his story, it might be this: power without reflection is a trap. Control bought at the expense of others always sends a bill. And the most dangerous myth is the one that says you can outrun consequence forever. In the end, Frank could not outrun consequence. It caught up in courtrooms, in hospitals, in quiet rooms where his own thoughts had time to replay. But his story, in all its messy contradiction, can still be useful. Not as a blueprint for daring, but as a soft warning whispered in the dark. Be careful what kind of empire you build to protect yourself. It might one day be the cage you live in. Harlem sleeps now and wakes again, as it always does, full of new schemes and old dreams. Somewhere the sun rises over Grange, North Carolina, touching fields that remember boys who once wanted more than the world offered. And somewhere in between those two places lives the echo of a man who tried to turn that wanting into power, and spent the rest of his life counting the true cost.